Offer a couple of thoughts in the build-on strategy, what we're building upon, the platform that's already here, and that's the existing community, that's the labor force. I promise I will talk about the Port Authority in a moment, but I think this is a sort of a prelude to the conversation that our board is having about how we participate into the future in Cleveland. Infrastructure and what I would call the wiring, the things that actually make value, and that's the uniquenesses of how we spend our money, and that's contracting and procurement, but it's much larger than that. It's access and attraction of capital to small and mid-sized companies. It's how to capitalize on the R&D assets, the research and development assets that are in our universities and some of the other major institutions, and I think we've probably just started to scratch the surface in that regard. That's the science of economic development as opposed to simply, I think, the practicing or the marketing of it. And then, marketing, I mean, it's one thing to tell the world or tell the community what we're about, but if we're not quite sure, I think we're probably not qualified quite to tell that story. So to me, that's the story of how you do economic development, and I'd give us reasonable marks in that regard, but probably not top of the class yet. I've talked about singular projects, and this doesn't necessarily mean rock and roll is bad or any of the other projects that have happened in stadiums, but they're expensive solutions that are exciting and attractive, and I think take the mind, the community's mind off the really substantial issues in front of a Cleveland or a metropolitan area, which is a larger strategy in the eyes of an investor. Will you invest in Cleveland? If you're in Cleveland, will you stay in Cleveland and grow? Does it have the right environment from labor force to tax structure, et cetera, to attract that investment? I think we can probably do a bit more in that. And just my rant about projects, or they're expensive and they don't connect the dots, and in the end, they probably aren't all that we should be. A bit about the Port Authority. What is it? We're created by government, so we're a government organization. In about 1968, the Cleveland-Cuyahoga County Port Authority was created. We're actually our own political subdivision, which means you got cities and counties, and you have organizations like port authorities. So we're not part of the city or the county, but somehow we are managed by the city and the county. The city of Cleveland and Cuyahoga County appoint our board of directors. So that's our connection to the public sector. And after that, we're told to go get on and be independent and do our job. And since I've arrived, we've made an extra special effort to say to our government partners, and that's with the county and the city, and now with other cities, what's the plan and how can we help you in larger and different ways? So that's the basic construct of who we are. Where can it work? State law says we can work anywhere. It actually doesn't really even prohibit us from working in Ohio, as long as it benefits you, as it benefits Northeast Ohio and particularly Cuyahoga County. So if we see a project that will benefit us, we can work outside of this area elsewhere in Ohio, et cetera. And there's been a bit of that. Some of the port authorities around the state have been involved in projects. And I'd like us to stay close to home, but strategically be involved in projects perhaps once in a while that are beyond. But I think it's a home first. And what's been our mission? It's been pretty specific. Waterborne cargo. We have a maritime port downtown. And we have this capacity under state law where we can issue debt. So like some governments can do, we issue very efficient debt in the form of bonds on behalf of certain sorts of projects. So a company may come to us and ask us to help them with financing, and we provide them access to credit markets, by and large, to purchasers in New York and other places for debt, and it's very efficient for the borrower. It's not the Port Authority's debt. We don't bear the risk or the burden, but we're a conduit. We've also been a conduit for some public projects where we help communities create sort of revitalization projects that might not have occurred otherwise. There we go. A little bit more about the maritime port. About 1,000 ships a year stop in Cleveland. in the port district, and I call it that, I don't think that's an official name, but in the port, on port facilities in Cleveland, and that's along the Cuyahoga River and along the lake where we control some property, there's about 15 million, it's a bit more than that, tons of cargo come into Cleveland and go out per year. Actually, the number I use is low on Port Authority property, but some portion of that, substantial portion, it's larger than that, comes through the Port Authority. It's growing each year as some property along the river and other places is wanting to be used for other sorts of uses, and for housing and so forth. So we see ourselves as maintaining control of real estate for the benefit of the community, for the benefit of companies that exist in the community, in Cleveland, but also not necessarily in Cleveland, that benefit from raw material, iron ore, and so forth. Some of it, a large part of it, related to steel making, and in some cases, some other industries. Iron ore, steel, and stone. So product will come in on pretty large ships, many of them from in the Great Lakes. From Minnesota, we'll bring in iron ore, and it will go up the river, and it will become steel, and it will go into steel processing companies elsewhere in the city or the region, or it might even leave the region. So lots of value is created in Cleveland from these bulk materials. Right now, the steelmaking production facilities in Cleveland are very efficient. They're owned by international companies, and they're some of the most efficient steelmaking operations in the world. We think there's every potential that they will stay there for a long, long time, and it's our job to make them as efficient as possible. There's many thousands of jobs in the mills and near the mills and transporting product that depend on that. I mentioned interlake, and I think there's a distinction here between where these ships come from. Probably 2/3 of the ships or so will come interlake. They're coming from another state or maybe even across from Canada, but they're staying within the Great Lakes. And several hundred ships a year right now come down the St. Lawrence Seaway to Cleveland, and they'll make perhaps other stops on the Great Lakes. And those ships, by and large, are from Northern Europe. Those ships are bringing steel from sister plants in the Netherlands and some other locations. So that's the Port Authority's maritime operations, and we say that there's 30,000 jobs that are really dependent on the fact that the Port Authority property is there and the way we use that in terms of supplying product to some of the operations that I just described. So where are we going? And I think this is the crux of what we wanted to talk to you about, and I'd love to answer questions and talk to you further about this. When I arrived 7 months ago, the board of directors, my bosses, said, look, we've got a great potential in Cleveland. We think there's great assets, and the organization called the Port Authority has great potential to help. That's all they said. Well, actually, they said a bit more. They said the uniqueness of the Port Authority and the way it's constructed in state law says that we have the power to do some things that governments do and some things that governments don't necessarily want to do or can't do. We could be a tool, I guess, is what they were saying. And we wanted to use that tool, they said, to issue debt, be a conduit for larger projects. We have the power of eminent domain, which the state has clipped the wings on the eminent domain law in the last year a little bit, but it still exists. And what if we could use those powers for the good of the region in a larger way? And that's the environment that I walked into, which is the Port Authority, which it had two core functions. One is to run the port, the maritime port, and the other was to issue some debt financing for these projects that I described earlier. And the board said, I think we want to play a larger role. So we've been going through a strategic planning process for the last several months, where the board has talked first amongst themselves to agree what they meant by that. And we've put out a document, it's on our website, that says, we think we can do more of all of that, and I'll describe a bit of that as I work towards wrapping up. The boards use the powers more effectively, and I think the issue here is scale and strategic emphasis. Where's the region going, and how can we make investments in and cause investments in larger initiatives around the technologies and industries that probably will be our future looking forward?